Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by the IRS Radio Hour with Stephen Leahy. Every Sunday afternoon at 5 on AM 560, The Answer.
If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Joe Biden writing in the New York Times op-ed, or somebody wrote for him, obviously.
Yeah.
That there is compelling evidence that assault weapon bans work, and he suggests in his piece a study that finds that the assault weapon ban that was in place between 94 and 04, there were fewer mass shootings, fewer deaths, fewer families needlessly destroyed. That's the Biden argument. Yeah. First, so we understand, 94 to 2004, there was no gun confiscation. It was just new, quote-unquote, assault weapons that were banned as defined by the law. There were just no new ones sold. It was illegal to sell new ones. Didn't confiscate the ones already in circulation. Again, as we've discussed before, but we'll discuss again, the definition of assault weapon focused on features that don't really affect a gun's lethality. Fewer murders are committed with, rifles, long guns of any kind, to say nothing of so-called assault weapons. Robert Verbruggen over at National Review goes through this as well. He said, look, there's important facts about mass shootings. One, they've been historically incredibly rare, entire years passing without one sometimes. Two, they're contagious with high-profile incidents inspiring copycats and competitors. Three, they're incredibly variable in the number of fatalities from, wherever a researcher chooses to set the low to all the way up to the 58 who were murdered in Las Vegas. So as writes Verbruggen, trying to detect a pattern in data like this and then attributing the pattern to a single law change that covered the entire country for a 10-year period is madness. Well, that's sort of what Joe Biden traffics in. But he's persuading some over the weekend from the insufferable S.E. Cupp, who is what passes for a Republican on CNN. Her commentary of why she has turned away from the NRA and is now part of the Do Something crowd.
Some Republican lawmakers have expressed an openness, but how sincere and serious they are remains to be seen. Now, for years, as you might know, I've gone on television and made the case for the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. I've pointed out that criminals don't follow gun laws, and I've defended the NRA and its members, law-abiding gun owners like me who have nothing to do with mass shootings or violent gun crimes. I've done that because I am a gun owner and a gun rights advocate, and I believed it was true. But I am no longer an NRA member. Being right no longer feels righteous because in the wake of more mass shootings, acts of senseless violence that send innocent people running for their lives, leaving children, orphaned, loved ones dead on the ground, we must do something about guns.
The Do Something crowd. And something she said there, which she thinks makes her come off well, really is the tell. I no longer feel what is right is righteous. And my feelings of self-righteousness trump doing what's right. That's what she's saying. And that's the sentimentality that afflicts the left and that they would afflict on a freedom-loving people. And unfortunately, some very receptive to that infliction of that affliction. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined again by John Lott, Jr., president of the Crime Prevention Center, author of books including The War on Guns and More Guns, Less Crime. John, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
So you decide who you want to respond to first. Joe Biden on the assault weapon ban specifically, or S.E. Cupp on the Do Something argument generally?
Well, I mean, I want to do something too, but I want to do something that actually matters. so much of these discussions, these background checks on private transfers of guns, there's not one mass public shooting this century that would have been stopped if such a law had been in effect. With regard to the assault weapons ban, even studies paid for by the Clinton administration wasn't able to find a benefit from this. And for some of the reasons that you mentioned, that they wanted to ban guns based on how they look. I mean, the key word here was military style, or style referred to how the gun looked on the outside, its cosmetic looks, rather than how it functioned. I mean, the vast majority of guns owned in the United States are semi-automatic guns. And to go and ban certain guns because they look like an M16, but function as any semi-automatic hunting rifle, just isn't obvious why one would expect it to have really any impact on anything, unless criminals or killers just cared about how the gun looks when they go and do a crime rather than how it functions. Why certain people like to have guns that look like military weapons, I mean, I guess it's just a question of taste. But it seems to me that most academics would care about how the gun actually functions, or police for that matter. I mean, you look at surveys of police officers, and I don't think the vast majority of them, 80% plus, think that, depending on the poll that you look at, think that this has any impact on crime rates generally or on mass public shootings.
Well, but do you agree, though, that something has to be done? What about President Trump, who's flip-flopped on this issue in the past, but he once again supports background checks? Is it a fantasy to think that the NRA is ever going to be on board with background checks?
Well, we have background checks.
Well, I don't.
Well,
I don't
extending
really
them from
care.
3 days to 10 days. Or
Right.
how about this? I have a
Well,
great idea.
okay, well, the
Interview
3 days-
get their high. This is what I think, because of the Dayton shooter. If you looked at his high school record, he had a rape list for girls, a kill list for
Right.
boys. Maybe, yeah, it's intrusive, but delving into people's high school records, or maybe having parental interviews, because the El Paso shooter's mom called and said, called police and said she was fearful because he bought an AK-47.
Except the
That's
problem.
by what she said.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
Paso moms called up and just asked if her son was able to own a gun.
Okay.
There was nothing. If she had maybe
There was no warning.
Fear.
Yeah, there was no warning. Number
But I'm
one.
saying if background
Number-
checks included those things.
But just on the point too, and then I'll let you respond, John. On Dayton, you just had a guy arrested who got the guns for the shooter,
and provided all the ammo for him.
and so then how does that deal with your suggestion of delving into his high school record? It would have solved nothing.
Well, everybody knew that he was a crazy loner.
He had a
weirdo.
friend get him guns who's now under arrest. Go ahead, John.
Right. Well, I think the friend is under arrest basically because he had a drug problem. But I mean, the thing is, the Dayton killer could have bought the guns himself. There was no criminal record that he had. I mean, it would be one thing if he had been prosecuted. He could have been prosecuted. One could argue he should have been prosecuted for the types of threats that he had made. The types of threats that he made are a crime. One can ask why the prosecutors didn't do their job on that. Maybe they thought that they had a weak case. I have no idea. But the fact that he did this 8-9 years ago, I mean, obviously that's a troublesome sign. But if prosecutors don't prosecute somebody, you have to ask what level of evidence do you have to have or past criminal records to determine whether or not somebody's going to be able to own a gun.
Well, the friend of the Dayton shooter was arrested because he bought body armor and a 100-round magazine and firearm accessories for his friend.
And he lied on his app.
He wasn't arrested per se because he bought those. He was arrested because he's a drug addict,
Right.
and he didn't fill out the form properly.
Right.
He lied in doing that, which is perjury. And he'll likely be prosecuted for engaging in perjury that's there, which is a 3-year criminal penalty in prison.
But John, speak to the larger issue of the quote-unquote, this phrase, and we've talked about on this show ad nauseum, but it just doesn't seem to take with some people. But the universal background check. Universal background check, universal background check, universal background check. It's a phrase that's just rinsed and repeated. and people have no idea what the background check system actually is that's in place, and address the gaps that are suggested by those who are proposing the quote-unquote universal background check.
Right. Well, universal background check deals with private transfers of guns. It's assuming that these people, that this killer in Dayton or whatever, couldn't have legally bought the gun himself, and he could have. I'm not really sure what the point of this is if they can't point to crimes that that would have been stopped as a result of having the law there. I mean, my own belief is that the reason why it keeps on getting pushed is that gun control advocates just want to make it costly for people in general to be able to go and get a gun. And you look at Washington, D.C., it costs $125 to privately transfer a gun. Could that be fixed? Sure, it could. And if they were to fix a couple minor things that are easily fixable with the law, my guess is everybody from the NRA and everybody else would be all in favor of passing these types of additional restrictions. The question you have to ask yourself is why gun control proponents argue tooth and nail against fixing the false positive problem when you have 3.5 million law-abiding citizens that have been not denied falsely from being able to go and buy guns because of errors in the background check system that could easily be fixed simply by requiring that the federal government has to meet the same rules for doing background checks that the federal government mandates that private companies have to meet in doing criminal background checks on employees. I mean, why is a rule, why are the regulations good enough for private companies to do criminal background checks, but the government doesn't have to meet those same standards?
Yeah, the false positives is a good issue that you raise. That's completely ignored otherwise. But let me ask you this about private transactions, private sales or transfers. The study out that looked back at all the mass shootings from '66 forward finds that in a majority of cases, the shooter obtained the weapon from a family or friend. So those talking about the universal background check would argue, well, there you go. So if we had a background check required of that private transaction, then perhaps some of those mass shooters could have been stopped. What do you say to that?
Right. Well, I mean, we've looked at all the cases from 1998 on, and there's not one of the cases that would have been stopped this century, not one single case. And people either got the gun through a direct purchase themselves or they got it by stealing the gun. And neither one of those would have been covered by those types of background checks. So, look, I want to do something on this stuff, but it seems to me that there's not a serious discussion about this. 95% of these mass public shootings take place in areas where the victims are banned from being able to have guns for protection. You look at cases like the Gilroy shooting that we just had. Right. You had metal detectors there. They were confiscating pocket knives from people who were trying to attend the festivities that were there. The killer went around, cut a hole in the back fence there to be able to go and bring his gun into an area where he knew none of the victims would be able to go and defend themselves. You have the Virginia Beach attack that occurred in a place where all the public employees were banned from having concealed handguns. Other municipalities in Virginia allow that. The killer even went into an area where an employee key card was necessary before he engaged in the attack. The Dayton attack that we just had, you had bars there in which were posted. The killer waiting right outside there, people coming out of an area facility where he knew that they weren't able to go and have guns for protection. Every one of the mass public shootings earlier this year, all were including places where people were banned. It's just not this year. These killers may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. They know if they want to kill as many people as possible, the best place to go is a place where the victims that they're going to be going after aren't going to be able to have a gun to be able to go and protect themselves. It's not rocket science on this, and one only needs to go and look at the statements. The El Paso killer talking about trying to figure out a place where there'd be soft targets. it's time after time, whether it's the Aurora Batman movie theater shooter or others. One just has to read the diaries and statements. The Charleston church shooter going, and his original target was going to be a place that he ended up turning down because he realized that people could have guns there in order to go and stop him from doing the attack. It's, one thing Amy mentioned, increasing the background check period from 3 to 10 days. That actually has to do with the so-called Charleston loophole that's there.
Yeah, and the
Congress
FBI messed
passed
that up.
Right. Well, they didn't mess it up.
Oh.
Anybody who actually, it's an example of the FBI under Obama being politicized in terms of the statements that they make. Go and ask a lawyer if you don't believe me on this, but under federal law, if you're arrested but not yet adjudicated, you're banned from being able to go and purchase a gun if the prison term that you face is up to 2 years or more. This Dylan Roof, in this case, was arrested for misdemeanor drug possession. The maximum prison term that he would have faced is 6 months. Under current federal law, he was not prohibited from being able to go and buy a gun. Now, maybe you want to change it so that if you're arrested for a misdemeanor and you face up to 6 months in prison, that you should be banned from having a gun. But that's not the fix that they're doing there. The fix that they're doing has nothing to do with the case that they're claiming. They could have checked the guy for 10 years or 20 years, and it still wouldn't have banned him under current law from being able to go and buy a gun. It's just amazing to me how much misinformation there is. It's kind of like they make things up as they go along in terms of these discussions, gun control advocates, just to kind of go and fit things. And now we have a bill that's passed on something that's completely unrelated to the actual facts of the case that they're using to name the bill after.
Yeah, well, perhaps their agenda is something other than public safety. Who would think that? He is John Lott Jr., president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, author of The War on Guns and More Guns, Less Crime. John, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.